Snow locked Europe in place. Roads vanished under ice. Rail lines froze solid. Engines refused to turn. Columns that should have moved in hours stalled for days. Maps became unreliable as distance stretched and time collapsed under winter. Across the continent, armies paused not by choice, but by weather. Inside a forward command headquarters, boots tracked slush across stone floors. Maps covered the walls, edges curling from damp air. Lamps burned low, casting long shadows over supply tables and fuel charts. Outside, wind pressed snow against windows hard enough to sound like impact. George S. Patton stood near the largest map, helmet under his arm, gloves still on. His posture never changed. The front lines were marked in thick strokes. The Ardennes shaded dark. The weather symbols clustered like warnings no one could erase. Europe was frozen. The enemy had moved anyway. Reports stacked quickly. German units pushing through the Ardennes. American positions bent, some breaking contact entirely. Roads, once considered secondary, now carried the weight of an offensive. Bastogne sat surrounded. Relief forces faced impossible distances under impossible conditions. Winter had become a weapon. Patton traced the map without touching it. His eyes followed routes others had already dismissed. Roads deemed impassable. Bridges assumed lost to ice. Movements calculated under peacetime logic. None of it mattered. He turned toward a second table filled with logistics reports. Fuel allocations reduced. Tire failure rates climbing. Vehicles abandoned where cold seized engines mid-route. Movement estimates rewritten again and again, each version slower than the last. Patton did not sit. He crossed the room, boots striking the floor with sharp rhythm. Officers worked around him, heads down, hands stiff from cold. No one spoke. The situation required no explanation. Europe had stopped moving. Patton did not intend to. Outside the building, trucks idled in uneven rows. Some engines ran only to keep oil from freezing solid. Soldiers worked with numb hands, loading supplies they were not certain would arrive anywhere on time. Breath hung in the air, thick and constant. Patton stepped to the doorway and watched the yard. The snow had turned gray from exhaust and boots. Men moved fast when ordered, slow when waiting. Winter punished stillness. He returned to map and focused on the distance between his position and the crisis to the north. The numbers were wrong by conventional standards. The terrain worse than the figures suggested. Weather forecasts offered nothing but continued obstruction. The distance remained. So did the necessity. Patton placed a marker on the southern edge of the front and another far north, near the pressure point. The line between them crossed territory that logistics officers had already crossed out. Frozen roads, narrow passes, entire towns buried. The movement required turning an army 90 degrees in winter. Not a unit, not a corps, an army. Fuel would have to appear where none existed. Traffic would have to flow through intersections never designed for it. Orders would have to reach men, while radios failed and lines froze. Patton adjusted the marker again, tightening the line. He walked to a small side table where weather reports lay scattered. Each page offered variation of the same truth. Snow continuing, ice deepening, visibility low, no relief. He pushed the papers aside. The conflict was no longer tactical. It was temporal. Every hour delay widened the gap. Every mile not moved tightened the enemy's hold. If winter dictated the pace, the war would follow it into paralysis. Patton turned back to the room and surveyed the staff. Faces were worn, eyes red, uniforms stiff from cold. They waited without speaking, aware that whatever came next would demand more than endurance. Patton removed his gloves and placed them on the map table. The leather cracked from the cold. Movement was the only answer winter did not control. He leaned forward and began aligning routes, not as they existed on paper, but as they would have to exist in reality. Convoys staggered, units leapfrogging, maintenance crews embedded forward. Traffic discipline enforced without exception. Nothing about it was cautious. Everything about it was deliberate. Outside, a truck engine finally caught, the sound cutting to the yard like a signal. Another followed, then another. Patton stood straight again. Europe was frozen. The war was not. and the order to move would test whether speed, will, and pressure could outrun the worst winter the continent had seen. The order rippled outward before the snow could settle again. Courtyards filled with movement. Trucks were pulled from ditches and jump-started in sequence. Mechanics worked under hoods with bare hands when gloves failed them. Tires were swapped, chains tightened, axles cleared of ice with hammers and boots. Routes were reassigned by necessity rather than preference. Main roads became arteries. Side roads became lifelines. Villages buried under snow turned into waypoints marked by church towers and crossroads no map fully captured. The army began to turn. Convoys stretched for miles, headlights dimmed, spacing measured by discipline rather than visibility. Traffic control points appeared where none had existed hours earlier. Military police stood in the snow directing flow, with rigid precision. No overtaking, no stopping without cause, no deviation without permission. Winter pushed back immediately. Engines failed in the open. Fuel lines froze mid-movement. Vehicles slid into ditches on descents no one remembered being steep. Each delay threatened to cascade to the column behind it. Patton remained in constant motion. He moved between command posts, motor pools, traffic junctions. His presence required no announcement. Orders traveled faster when he stood nearby. Corrections were made on the spot. Delays were addressed without ceremony. Maps were updated continuously. Routes crossed out, redrawn, recrossed. Progress was measured in miles gained and hours stolen from the weather. Snow intensified through the night. Wind stripped warmth from exposed skin. Men rotated positions in vehicles to keep circulation alive. Drivers slapped hands against steering wheels between turns. Soldiers slept sitting upright, rifles across laps, waking at every halt. Supply discipline tightened. Fuel trucks were pushed forward under escort. Ammunition loads were redistributed to reduce strain. Non-essential equipment was left behind without debate. Speed mattered more than completeness. The turn continued. Units originally oriented east now faced north. Artillery columns maneuvered through spaces barely wide enough to pass. Tanks moved where roads allowed, halted where ice refused them, rerouted without complaint. Radio traffic surged, then thinned as batteries weakened. Messengers filled the gaps. Written orders traveled by hand through snow and darkness. The enemy did not expect movement. Intercepted reports showed confidence hardening into assumption. Winter was believed to be enough. Roads were assumed blocked. Time was presumed available. That presumption began to fail. Patton tracked the front not as a line, but as a race. Every mile gained mattered only if gained before resistance reoriented. Every hour saved denied the enemy preparation. At key junctions, convoys compressed, then expanded again like breath. Bottlenecks formed and were broken. Vehicles disabled by cold were dragged aside, marked, and abandoned without hesitation. Men accepted it without protest. They understood the exchange being made. As dawn approached, snow thinned briefly. Visibility increased just enough to reveal the scale of movement. Columns extended beyond sight. Smoke from exhaust hung low over frozen ground. Patton stood at a road junction as units passed, boots planted in packed snow. He watched the flow, adjusted spacing with hand signals, redirected an entire column onto a secondary route when ice glazed the primary. No speeches followed, only motion. The front to the north remained under pressure. Reports confirmed continued encirclement and tightening enemy control. The clock did not slow for progress. It only punished delay. The movement accelerated. By the second night, the army had covered distances that logistics tables said were impossible in winter. Vehicles arrived damaged but moving. Men arrived exhausted but intact. The cold took its share. Frostbite cases increased. Engines were lost. Some never arrived. The columns did not stop. Patton reviewed positions under lamplight as snow returned. He marked progress with short strokes, never exaggerating gains, never ignoring setbacks. The front shifted closer with each update. The enemy began to react. Artillery repositioned. Patrols probed roads now alive with movement. Air reconnaissance attempted to pierce cloud cover, limited and unreliable. Winter still favored defense. Speed challenged it. The maneuver no longer resembled a redeployment. It resembled an advance through resistance imposed by nature itself. And the army continued to move, mile by mile, refusing to let ice decide the outcome. Night pressed down again, heavier than before. Snow returned in uneven waves, coating tracks as soon as they were made. The columns advanced through darkness shaped by engine noise and discipline rather than sight. Distance was counted by fuel consumed and hours endured. The movement reached its most fragile phase. Routes narrowed. Terrain rose and fell without warning. Forests closed on the roads, branches bending under ice and breaking onto vehicles below. Traffic control points became lifelines, holding order where chaos would have spread in minutes. Patton followed the movement from forward positions, not from a single room. He arrived at junctions before problems fully formed. He studied stalled vehicles, frozen culverts, blocked bridges. Solutions came fast, never perfect, always sufficient. A tank blocked a mountain road after losing traction. Chains were added, then doubled when it still failed. It was pulled aside by two half-tracks without delay. The column flowed around it and continued. Fuel consumption rose beyond forecasts. Trucks burned more just to stay alive. Supply officers recalculated constantly, shifting reserves forward, stripping rear areas bare to keep momentum intact. The army bent around obstacles instead of breaking against them. The enemy began to notice. Probes appeared along the routes. Isolated engagements flared and vanished. Small arms fire echoed briefly through trees, then disappeared under engine noise. The movement did not slow. Security elements absorbed contact and rejoined the column without ceremony. Winter still punished every mistake. A convoy misjudged a descent and slid into a ravine. Recovery crews marked the site and moved on. The road could not afford closure. Another route absorbed the traffic. Patton marked the loss later, once movement resumed. The turning point came quietly. Reports from the north showed hesitation. Enemy units began shifting, unsure whether the movement was reinforcement, deception, or something larger. Artillery repositioned away from primary axes. Pressure on encircled positions eased unevenly, then consistently. Time began to work differently. Hours that once felt lost now accumulated advantage. Each mile covered shortened response windows. Each night survived denied the enemy's certainty. Patton reviewed the latest positions under low light. The distance remaining was still significant, but the impossible had become merely difficult. The army was no longer racing winter alone. It was racing an opponent forced to react. Snow fell again, but columns moved through it with practiced rhythm. Drivers learned the road by repetition. Crews slept in shifts measured by engine cycles. Maintenance teams repaired vehicles under tarps strung between trees. Hands raw, movements precise. The movement hardened into routine. Enemy resistance sharpened near the forward edge. Artillery fire increased. Roads cratered. Bridges were damaged but held long enough for passage. Engineers moved ahead of the columns, clearing paths under fire and weather. Patton adjusted the advance without hesitation. Units leapfrogged. Lead elements changed. Pressure remained constant. The winter could slow movement. It could not stop it. As the army closed the final distance, reports from the front shifted tone. Encirclement loosened. Supply drops increased in effectiveness. The trap no longer spoke only of survival, but of contact. Patton paused a forward command post and studied the terrain ahead. Snow still covered everything, but tracks now pointed in one direction, forward. The decision to move had passed beyond debate. The reflection phase ended not with certainty, but with commitment reinforced by progress. The confrontation was no longer hypothetical. It waited ahead, where speed would meet resistance under the weight of winter, and the outcome would decide whether movement itself could rewrite the season. The final approach began before dawn. Snow fell lightly, almost without sound, as lead elements reached the outer edge of the pressure zone. The roads narrowed further, scarred by shell impacts and churned by retreating vehicles. The air carried distant echoes of artillery, muted by weather and terrain. The army did not pause. Columns compressed, then surged forward in controlled waves. Armor advanced where ground allowed. Infantry moved along tree lines and frozen fields. boots breaking crusted snow with each step. Engineers worked ahead of the lead, clearing obstacles under fire and ice. Enemy resistance intensified. Artillery fire closed roads moments after passage. Small arms engagements flared at junctions and dissolved just as quickly. The enemy attempted to seal routes already in use, but timing betrayed them. Patton remained forward, shifting units by minutes rather than hours. Orders were brief, transmitted through every means available. Momentum was protected at all cost. The breakthrough came in fragments. A road reopened under fire. A bridge held long enough. A column arrived where no arrival had been calculated. Each success stacked onto the last until the effect became undeniable. Contact was made. Forces long, under pressure, felt the change first. Relief did not arrive as a single wave, but as sound movement and presence where none had existed. The enemy, unprepared for speed under winter, faltered. The front cracked. Encirclement collapsed unevenly, then completely. Units trapped by assumption now moved freely. Supply routes reopened under cover of snow and fire. What had been a sealed pocket became contested ground again. The climax did not announce itself. It revealed itself through absence. The absence of enemy advance. The absence of inevitability. The absence of winter's total control. Patton watched the map update in real time. Lines straightened. Pressure arrows reversed. Space returned to the front. The cost was visible. Vehicles burned where ice and fire met. Men fell where movement demanded too much. The ground absorbed it without comment. The movement held. Enemy forces withdrew under pressure they could not match in timing. Winter slowed them now, turning their assumptions into obstacles. Roads clogged. Fuel shortages multiplied. Coordination failed under stress. The same cold that had paralyzed Europe now punished hesitation. As night returned, air support struck through breaks in the cloud cover. Targets exposed by movement were hit with precision made possible only by disruption on the ground. The climax settled not in triumph, but in control. Patton stood at a forward junction as units passed through, faces streaked with snow and oil, eyes focused ahead. The army had arrived not intact, not unscathed, but in time. Winter had not been outrun. It had been met with speed equal to its cruelty. The decisive moment passed without ceremony. No pause followed. Movement continued through the night. Consolidating ground gained under the harshest conditions. The record time was not measured in distance alone. It was measured in refusal. Refusal to accept paralysis. Refusal to let weather dictate outcome. Refusal to stop when stopping meant failure. The climax ended as it began, with troops still moving forward through snow that no longer defined the limits of the war. Part 5, reflective and powerful closing. Morning returned without warmth. The snow lay disturbed now, marked by tracks, shell scars, abandoned equipment, and the slow movement of men reorganizing under low clouds. The landscape no longer looked untouched. It looked used, contested, changed. The front held. Units that had arrived in fragments aligned into structure. Defensive lines formed where chaos had existed. Supply routes stabilized. Still fragile, but functional. Engines ran in cycles, no longer constantly threatened by cold alone. Patton stood near a roadside command post, helmet resting on a crate, coat pulled tight. He watched columns pass in both directions now. Forward elements reinforcing, damaged vehicles moving back, wounded evacuated under escort. Movement had become balance. Maps were updated with steadier hands. Lines no longer shifted violently with each report. The war resumed a shape that allowed planning beyond survival. The winter remained. It always would. But it no longer controlled the rhythm of the front. Patton walked along the road edge, boots crunching frozen snow. Soldiers saluted briefly and returned to their tasks. No speeches followed. No explanations were needed. The movement spoke for itself. The army had turned, advanced, and arrived under conditions that denied logic. It had not been elegant. It had not been safe. It had been relentless. The record time would appear later in reports, in numbers stripped of cold, exhaustion, and loss. On the ground, it existed only as memory and result. Encirclement broken. Pressure relieved. Momentum restored. Patton paused and looked north, where the road disappeared into trees and rising ground. The war continued there, shaped now by choices made under winter rather than surrender to it. He turned back toward the command post and lifted his helmet, placing it on without ceremony. Orders waited. Movements remained. Speed would still matter. The season had tested whether motion could exist without comfort. It had answered. Europe had frozen. The army had not. And in that refusal, time itself had been forced to yield.